Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to declare us in order here. It's 10 after 2 by my clock, which by historic tradition, Berkeley classes start 10 minutes after the hour. It looks like serious rain out there, so I'm trying to bike home, so I'm not going to be holding you any longer than I'm allowed to, and maybe dash out the door a little ahead of you. So a couple of things. First of all, also welcome back our podcast audience. Let me urge you again, if you're listening to this on podcast to get the most out of the class, please email me at jsimon@law.berkeley.edu or Google Jonathan Simon Berkeley, and I will add you to the course website, which will allow you to download the syllabus, which has all the readings, mostly with hyperlinks that will take you to a PDF of the article. If you're on a networked computer, if you're listening to this in Thailand or Russia or even in Arkansas, you may, depending where you are, you may need to consult with your local librarian to get those readings. Some of them will be on our website, and if they are, they're on the course, the resources section of the course website, which I'll be joining you to. Keep in mind, for those of you listening from the FBI, that we at Berkeley do not endorse any illegal downloading of anyone's intellectual property. Let me also encourage people in the class to take a careful look at the syllabus. I invited you to do that last time, and I'm certainly happy to answer your questions about it today. It's a fairly detailed syllabus that lays out both some of the requirements of the course, all of the requirements of the course, other than those that will be addressed to your section by your section GSIs, but also gives you a fairly, I hope, decent picture of what each class will be about. Technically, I didn't quite finish up with class 1 yesterday, and I'm going to, and then this will be class 2. I hope to be caught up by the end of today. That'll be my goal. Let me also just mention, some of you hopefully will have seen the memo I sent out about the negotiations class at Berkeley Law. I just want to mention it briefly. It's not, those of you listening on podcast, this is not something you'll be eligible for, but if you're an undergraduate here at Berkeley in this room, and if you're thinking about a law career, and I realize many of you may be interested in theology, criminology, human rights, if you're actually focusing on a law career, this is a really unique opportunity, and I'll take your question in just one moment. Most people don't realize, if you've been watching movies all your life, unless you watch The Social Network, that most of law takes place in depositions. Usually at the end of a good round of depositions, the lawyers know who's going to win, and so they settle the case. They don't need to go to court. So basically, the battle of lawyers takes place in the deposition room. If you saw The Social Network, it really did a good job of showing you how the whole case really unfolds in a deposition. This course is unlike a lot of the first-year courses you see where you're just sitting in the back of a room. This is what we call a skill course at Bolt, where you'll have second and third-year students who are really heading into this kind of practice, getting practice, making arguments, and interacting with some of the best trial lawyers, civil litigation lawyers, since they don't really get a trial anymore, deposition lawyers in the Bay Area. Obviously, as somebody inside for the course, you're going to get some of the benefit of the course. In terms of social networking, you're going to meet some of these very top lawyers and current Bolt Law students and faculty. In any event, I think they can only take 6 or 8 students, but it does take a fair amount of time commitment. I know not everyone has it. Anyway, take a look at it. If it's for you, please contact. There's some contact information on that memo, which I think I'll send out again this afternoon after I get home. Yeah.
I did it last fall.
Oh, fantastic.
It was a lot of fun. I recommend anyone who's really interested to do it. It was a great way to finish the semester. It was really good. So intro law school experience.
Yeah, when you consider the fact that half of all law school graduates end up leaving the practice of law at some point, it would be much more efficient and much cheaper for some of you to decide on this side of that experience whether law is really the career that you want to pursue. Okay, so questions about the syllabus or anything else on your mind? I'm sorry? So I think the class is called, I believe it's called Negotiations, and the professor is Henry Hecht. He's been a long time, he was a professor when I was as a very young man, when I was a student, and he's really one of the country's eminent, he spends a lot of time going to law firms and training the lawyers there on how to do a better job in these settings. So it's a unique opportunity. I will send that out by BSpace again. I won't be bothering you about this again, but it's something that has to start very soon, so I want to make sure all of you who are interested have that opportunity. Any other questions about either some of the stuff we covered last time, or the syllabus, or something you saw on the news this morning? And keep your eye on the newspapers, and whatever news sources you use. I know it's very archaic to talk about newspapers, blogs, the Jon Stewart Show. You'll be surprised how often issues of punishment culture and society will come up. So I want to take you back to this, I think, searing image of the dry cells in California. This is the kind of image that I think, when we studied a little bit more of the history of debate about penal practices and about the development of human rights consciousness in especially the Western world since the middle of the 18th century, this is an image that bears comparison to some of the scenes we'll see depicted in painting, because there was no photography in the 18th century, of the jails and dungeons that were a great source of scandal to the Enlightenment public intellectuals in the 18th century. People like Beccaria, whose work we'll look at next week. And if you read that Supreme Court case, Brown versus Plata, carefully, I think you can hear, even in the written words of the court, just how much this sort of seared their consciousness. And it's an interesting, I think, feature of this kind of very physical, very existential kind of suffering that is right at the very core of what we might call the modern human rights consciousness, right? So it's the experience of these jails and dungeons and asylums being exposed in the 18th century shocked people. In the 19th century, it was learning about the fate of wounded soldiers on the battlefields of Europe at a time when armies didn't come with hospital corps and people were just left to die of their wounds. That gave rise to the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions in the middle of the 19th century. So you get this sort of in a series of waves, this consciousness that that there's a humanity to people that requires a certain kind of deference, a certain kind of limitation on sovereign power, whether that's on the battlefield or whether that's on a scaffold. Now, the perimeters of the sort of how much that restrains us is obviously always up for debate. There's a remarkable amount of consensus, though, around the world today, for instance, that we don't torture people. I mean, this is something we're puzzling on today when we're going to talk about capital punishment. It's legal and considered to be not a violation of human rights according to the major human rights treaties that we're signatories to, like the Universal Convention of Charter of Human Rights, the UN's major human rights document. It is not a violation of that to execute somebody after a lawful trial in some kind of modern procedure. I mean, if you wanted to crucify somebody that might raise, or stone somebody, this has come up with Iran and some other countries, it may raise international law issues. If you want to give somebody lethal injection or hang them, which is typical in Iran, for instance, hanging, that's not a human rights violation. It is in Europe and the Americas, some other places where more regional conventions have defined it as such. Torturing somebody, even though the person might prefer to be tortured rather than actually executed, right, can be waterboarded 286 times and still walk away from the experience as bad as that is, and yet one is considered a human rights violation, one is. That's a curious thing. I think we ought to be more puzzled by it sometimes than we are. We ought to think more about it. We'll have a chance to. The point I really want to make about this case now, though, is simply that it brings this issue right to the core of our domestic prison system. We're used to thinking about human rights violations in Europe after World War II and during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in parts of the Middle East, where there are great migrant flows because of natural disasters and civil wars around the world. We can even, thanks to 9/11, imagine some of this stuff happening in U.S. establishments around the world, like Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib. It's a little bit different to say, no, something that really approximates torture, even in the eyes of the U.S. Supreme Court, is happening not even in one of our marginal states, but in arguably the greatest state in the United States, and certainly our largest prison system. Now, as I suggested to you, when you go home at spring break, if you talk to your neighbors, etc., about this case, which I hope you will, I think you're going to get a number of responses. First of all, people are going to be shocked at the idea that prisoners have a right to health care. And you're going to have to help them understand that a right to health care sounds very abstract, But when you're already sick and you're in a place where you have no access to medical care, it's the equivalent of being tortured. If you can't breathe because of asthma and all you would need is just your asthma inhaler, that's kind of like torture. The analogy would be if you can't get your own food, which is certainly true if you're in a jail cell, and nobody gives you any food and you starve to death, I think most people would agree that that approximates torture and that would be unconscionable. So you help them over that bump. But then they may not want to say this, but some of them are going to think, and maybe some of you think, well, if the people in prison are murderers and rapists, say, people who have degraded their victims, who have done horrible things to their victims, maybe I'm okay with torturing them. I don't think a lot of people might think that and not say that, but you might want to think about some of the reasons why there is this near universal acceptance on the level of at least explicit agreement that we don't torture people in these kinds of circumstances. Again, there can be debates about emergency situations, and indeed, if you look at the larger lesson of this case, it takes us in that direction. But I want to just highlight this point. Moments of suffering have this odd, especially this kind of physical suffering when you imagine somebody reeling with hallucinations and mental illness, naked and suicidal in a cage like that for weeks. It has an odd quality. On the one hand, this is a pretty bad situation. It's about as bad as a situation can be. You're in a situation that political theorist Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. You've kind of been stripped of your status as a citizen, as a parent, as a child. You're kind of just a human body in extremis. And yet, ironically, it's at that moment that you appear to other people viewing you as essentially a human being with no other attributes to you than your humanity, something that the Supreme Court referred to as the essential dignity of human beings. Right? That's all that you have left, which is not a great place to be. Hannah Arendt wrote a great deal about how dangerous it is to have nothing left but your humanity to plead with. But as we've seen around the world, that's a very powerful image. It tends to make it very hard for people to disregard your concerns. Right? So even somebody who, picture not just this scene, but I gave you some of the images from the case of physical illness, the young man who died of testicular cancer after receiving no treatment for 17 months. Right? Whatever, I don't know what he did, but imagine whatever you want about what he did. Would you still be able to say that you felt somehow comforted by the experience of pain that he went through? I think a lot of people, in principle, might affirm that, but if they actually confronted it, as the court had to do in these pictures, I think it does pose this question of what do we owe people's basic humanity? And that's the situation we're in California. We have a humanitarian crisis in the prisons. And I want to emphasize that it's not the case that the state of California, which was the defendant in this case, or the dissenting justices, took the position that torture is okay and that we ought to be comfortable with people having these kinds of extreme conditions of suffering in prisons. Rather, their position was, sure, this is terrible, sure, we've got to do something about it, but the court can't require us to release prisoners because that would impose these grave dangers on public safety. There's this trade-off between dignity and risk, essentially. We may not believe in torture, but we may be willing to consider it, as has been debated in this country after 9/11, if it's somehow tied in with preventing a terror attack. Likewise, we may not accept the idea of people being degraded and experiencing this kind of grave suffering in prison, but if the alternative is exposing innocent people in the community to the risk of violent crime, there's a hesitance there. And indeed, the majority of the Supreme Court acknowledged that in talking about the dangers of recidivism. One of the remarkable, I should say, sort of the other remarkable thing then about Brown versus Plata and about the situation California's in now is that not only did it confront us with this human rights problem in our prisons, but it actually forces us to think about this trade-off between dignity and risk, largely not because of the Eighth Amendment and its promise of forbidding cruel and unusual punishment, but because of a statute that Congress passed in the 90s and that President Clinton signed called the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996, which essentially made it harder for inmates to generally bring civil rights suits through the federal courts, and specifically made it very difficult for federal courts to order population releases or prison population caps of any sort. And one of the most important ways they did that is by requiring the court, in deciding whether a population reduction was necessary, to give very significant weight to public safety. And I think that's a part of this case that I want you to think about too as you eventually read it, and you'll have a chance to read the longer three-judge court opinion that it upheld. Because of the Prison Litigation Reform Act, the 14-day trial that the three-judge court had about the prison population problem, 10 of those 14 days went to this issue of public safety. Can we have a smaller prison population and still maintain public safety? And the court said yes, after looking at a lot of evidence. And one of the most interesting things about the moment we're in now in California is, although there's been all this focus on release from prison, which by the way is, as I said, very misleading, because it's almost certain to be the case that nobody who was actually in prison at the time Brown versus Plata was decided will be released early. What instead is happening is that we're redistributing people who would have gone to prison to other parts of our penal system. And this gives me a moment to talk a little bit about the other parts of our correctional system. We tend to focus a lot on prison. When you say to most people crime and punishment, it's prison or maybe jail that they think of. And yet, as you can see, and by the way, this comes from a very useful source that many of you will be interested in. The Pew Charitable Trust has a whole website about incarceration, and they've tried to look at both imprisonment and other forms of correctional custody for every state in the union. And they have fact sheets for every state, and I've posted one for California on the website, our website. You can also find it on the web. But this table comes from that. And as you can see, we have many more people in probation and parole, which are two forms of correctional custody in which you're basically in the community, you're not behind bars, but you're under various forms of legal constraint. You have all kinds of rules that you have to follow. You may have to live in a certain place that the parole or probation agent has agreed to. You have to seek approval to change your job if you have a job. You have to seek approval to get married. So there are many kinds of civil rights disabilities. You may be required to wear an ankle bracelet if there's an order that requires you to stay away from your spouse or from a certain area where drugs are sold. So it's a very broad set of techniques, but one that we, in the era of mass incarceration, Californians haven't given much thought to. It's sort of like assuming that food means hamburgers, which some Americans seem to. When it comes to punishment, we think of prison as punishment. But even now, the vast majority of people under correctional custody are in other forms. As I said, probation and parole. Probation is a county-level supervision status that usually results either in lieu of a jail sentence or along with a jail sentence. Jail, just to clarify that, is a form of incarceration, of being locked up, either because you're awaiting trial and you haven't been able to get bail, or because you've been sentenced to a jail term. Now, one of the things that California's now done, and we'll talk about this in a moment with realignment, is lift the limits on how long you can be sent to jail. So many more felony offenders who would have had to serve their time in prison can now legally be sent to jail. So Brown versus Plata puts the spotlight on these other forms of penal custody. And most importantly, it requires us to think about how we might use them differently. Over the last 20 or 30 years, instead of being really alternatives to incarceration, probation, parole, and parole in particular, have operated in many ways as a kind of a feedback loop that sends people back to prison eventually. It either delays when you eventually get to prison, if you start with probation and then violate that probation and go to prison, or in the case of parole, one of the reasons our prisons are so overcrowded in California is that half the people coming into prison were coming from parole violation status. In other words, they were in the community as a released prisoner. They had done something to violate their conditions, typically turned in a dirty drug test, missed some appointments. They may have been arrested for a crime, but instead of trying them for a new crime, the practice from the time I was a graduate student, I wrote my dissertation on this, all the way until October 1st of this year, when realignment went into effect, was to send most of those parole violators, and we're talking about 70,000 people a year, back to prison, typically for 4 or 5 months. And this was a complete disaster It meant that the prisons were crowded with people who were very short-term offenders. Typically, their files wouldn't even catch up with them before they had to kind of get out. All these medical problems we've been talking about were exacerbated for these folks because they were being processed through a system that never really got caught up to who they were, and therefore couldn't get their medical records in place, couldn't get them the drugs they needed if they were had mental illnesses, etc. Lots of these people were essentially in prison, serving no appreciable social value for that, and actually making the larger system dysfunctional, also resulting in people coming out of prison. This is particularly acute for mentally ill prisoners who may have gotten sent back to prison on a parole violation because they weren't on their medications. Lots of people who have serious mental illnesses aren't able to stay on their medication by themselves without some supervision, some assistance. They don't recognize the symptoms of their illness, or they don't like the medication they're on. In any event, they may get sent back to prison because of a parole violation that was caused by their mental illness. If you're wandering around and we're in a catatonic state, you're going to miss appointments, you're going to, if you're self-medicating with illegal drugs, you're going to turn in dirty drug tests, all those things happen. Then you get sent back to prison where you get worse because they don't have time to get to you to see what drugs you need to be on. And by the time you get released again in 5 months, you've decompensated, which is the technical term for getting worse in a mental illness, and now you're released in even worse shape. So that's the kind of cycle that the Supreme Court pointed to in agreeing with the three-judge court that the risk of sending fewer people to prison is actually potentially an outside risk. That is, we might be able to improve public safety by keeping more people in probation and parole, where they might, if we focus on keeping them in the community rather than rushing them back to prison, we might be able to achieve actually better outcomes. At least that's a lot of what the evidence seems to suggest. So it's one of the reasons I think we're at such an exciting moment. You can put the emphasis on population reduction at the prison level, but it also means reinventing these other forms of penal custody, which have, as I said, been very much caught up in mass incarceration rather than representing a real alternative. This is particularly, here you get a picture of change over time, and as you can see, the big run-up from the 80s hasn't just been in prison population, it's been in all of these. Look at the growth of probation, for instance. That's lots of people getting relatively minor convictions, but once they're on probation, there's a really good chance that they can go to prison in recent years. That's what may be changing. The other upside of this is again from the Pew data. You get a picture here of spending, right? And the blue line is spending on prison, and just compare it for a moment to spending on probation, right? So we first of all notice that escalation of the cost of imprisonment has been much higher than the other costs, even though it starts at a higher base. And that's partly because of this medical problem. The more sicker people you have in prison, it's very expensive to deliver medical care there. It also because correctional officers get paid a great deal. They're some of the highest paid public employees in the state. There's a couple of points to be taken from this. One is the high burden we're dealing with having so many people in prison. The happy story, I suppose, is that if under realignment, and we'll be studying this toward the end of the course in great depth, we in California can really reinvent how we use probation and parole and even jail so that we're not just sending people to prison a little bit later or over and over again for a short time. Look at the kind of cost savings. Everybody who moves from a prison cell to being on probation, the cost is dropping through the floor, right? So if what we're doing now is moving bodies to the county level and telling the county, and Governor Brown just said in his State of the Union, or State of the State address, I should say, yesterday, that he would seek a constitutional amendment to guarantee funding to the counties to pay for the added responsibility for prisoners that they are now going to have. But if they can do that successfully, if they can find ways to move people from prison and jail to probation, the cost savings they can achieve will end up in schools, they'll end up in county mental health services, they'll end up in libraries, they'll end up in all the other things that counties do, which if you've been in California for a while, you'll know are very, very hard pressed, especially in this period of recession. So let me just close this extension of lecture one by looking a little bit over the horizon beyond Brown versus Platter. Where does it leave us? There's one possibility, one direction is that it won't really turn out, notwithstanding the amount of hot air that I've been pumping out about it, to be a very important case. It might turn out that it's really a case about California's uniquely bad prison system and how dysfunctional and how dangerous it had become, with little bearing on other American penal systems or on American penal practices or philosophy more broadly. That's a possibility, and maybe California will get through this terrible Great Recession, tax revenues will go up again, and instead of having 33 prisons as we now do, when I'm teaching this in 2017 or 2025, we'll have 50 or 60 or 80 prisons, and we'll be out of the hands of the courts because we'll have gotten our population overcrowding under control, but we'll have a massive and permanent prison population. That is a possibility. I believe there's a real possibility we can go the other way, though. That not only are we going to reinvent and re-energize these alternative forms of punishment and seek a more locally based kind of justice. I think if we take Brown very seriously, it raises a lot of questions about our other forms of punishment that we currently do that are troubling, that we'll be looking at in some depth in this course. One, for instance, is life without parole sentences. This very term, the Supreme Court will consider whether juveniles who have committed homicide can be given a life without parole sentence. That is a sentence in which, unless they're pardoned by the governor, which as you know is it's like buying a lottery ticket, very unlikely, unless you're in Mississippi apparently, very unlikely. That question is now before the Supreme Court. Is that a violation of the 8th Amendment? Just 2 or 3 years ago in Graham versus Florida, they said for juveniles that did not commit a homicide, that committed a burglary, robbery, and got a life without parole sentence, which Florida was handing out, that was cruel and unusual. And they used language that tipped up to the notion of dignity. They talked about the right to hope, to have some hope that you could eventually get out of prison. So this year we'll find out in June whether juveniles who have killed can nonetheless get a life without parole sentence. What we're going to read about, there was a profile in the New Yorker of one such 16-year-old who killed his grandfather, as a matter of fact, and you'll read that for the class. If we take Brown versus Platter very seriously, that dignity animates the 8th Amendment, which is a very strong affirmation of that basic human rights premise, I think LWOP, which is raises real questions about dignity. Can you really say you're respecting the dignity of a human being if there's nothing they could do that would change your mind that they need to be in prison, right? Which is what you're saying when you say LWOP. That raises real questions about dignity. Yeah. I will post it. I'm terrible at case names, and it's probably not the only things I forget, but I will get that up there, and it'll be on the B space, but I'll put out an announcement on it. Another thing that I think is going to have to come up for serious review under this broader dignity notion is what's nationally called supermax imprisonment. This is typically 24/7 isolation, sometimes double-celled isolation, which is a peculiar paradox. Only in California is that done. But as you know, many people in California, there's been some hunger strikes this year coming out of these. In California, we call them secured housing units or SHUs. That's Pelican Bay, which, as you can see, is a building that communicates the notion of kind of toxic waste warehouse, which in many ways is what it is. Back in 1995, Judge Stelton Henderson, the very same judge who has conducted the Plata case, the physical illness case, upheld Pelican Bay in principle, said that it doesn't violate the 8th Amendment just to put somebody in a lockdown 24/7 isolation facility with no programming, even for years, which is the situation. He did hold that if you were mentally ill, then they had to take you out of the SHU. He noted with alarm that one of the effects of being in the SHU is that you become mentally ill. So